Everyone, I hope y'all are doing well. We are moving into First Kings chapters 3 and 4, a little bit of 10, but mainly just First Kings chapters 3 and 4. And this is one of the more straightforward and, practical pieces of the Bible study that we've had so far, but still with a lot of context that we could dive into, a lot of things. This is the story of Solomon receiving wisdom and blessing from the Lord, and it's one that we may be more familiar with, especially if you've kind of been around like kids ministry, if you've gone through you know Sunday school, things like that. But it's stuff that I think for us, as we're looking at the passage, still points ahead in a lot of interesting ways, not just to Solomon's future, the future of Israel, but also to Jesus, to God Himself. And so, what we're going to do through this study is we're going to read 1 Kings chapter 3, and then little snippets of chapter 4, and a little bit of chapter 10 as well. But mainly we're going to be sticking in 1 Kings chapter 3 for the majority of our text. So to start off, we'll be reading 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. So it says, Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, by marrying Pharaoh's daughter. Solomon brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace, the Lord's temple, and the wall surrounding Jerusalem. So already right now, we're kind of like, you see 1 Kings as being written from a, anachronistic. It's outside of the time frame, right? Because he's not going to start building the temple and the palace until a few chapters from here, but we see these things happening. It says verse 2, however, the people were sacrificing on the high places because until that time a temple for the Lord's name had not been built. Solomon loved the Lord by walking in the statutes of his father David, but he also sacrificed and burned incenses on the high places. King went to Gibeon to sacrifice there because it was the most famous high place. He offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. So kind of what we're seeing on this little intro passage is a really interesting kind of set of verses, because you're seeing a little bit of setting, a little bit of context, but also you're seeing kind of glimpses at who Solomon is and what he unfortunately will also become. Because you see him saying like, hey, there's no temple, there's no place to sacrifice, so all these people are just kind of sacrificing on high places because that's what they had done. That's not necessarily sinful. And it says Solomon loved the Lord by walking in the statutes of his father's David. But the author of First King is really intentional to include this kind of negative conjunction, right? But, except, right? Whatever your translation might say, he also sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. It's kind of pointing where it's like, he may not be sinning in this moment, but he's kind of skirting the line. It's pointing ahead to things that are going to be dangerous to him, especially as it relates to the first verse of the chapter, right? It says that Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh by marrying his daughter. And again, it's not necessarily sinful, but what is sinful is this is not his first wife. And it's also the danger of, there's this weird kind of trend in Israel's history of marrying these, people from foreign countries. And the problem is not intermarriage. The problem is associating their gods to yourself as opposed to bringing God to those cultures, to those peoples. And that is going to be the downfall of Solomon. So already I think the author is kind of pointing us ahead towards what's going to come, is that Solomon is going to have these hundreds of women that he is married to, that he's intimate with, whatever, and he is going to introduce their systems of worship into Israel, and that's going to lead Israel into this split and into decay spiritually. And so we see this already starting to take fruit here, even though he is at this moment walking in the Lord, walking in the statutes that David had done, all these things. We continue on, and this is the part of the passage that, if you're aware of it, probably is going to be a little bit more familiar. It says, at Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night. God said, ask, what should I give you? And Solomon replied, you have shown great and faithful love to your servant, my father David, because he walked before you in faithfulness, righteousness, and integrity. You have continued this great and faithful love for him by giving him a son to sit on his throne as it is today. Lord my God, you have now made your servant king in my father David's place. Yet I am just a youth with no experience in leadership. Your servant is among your people you have chosen, a people too many to be numbered or counted. So give your servant a receptive heart to judge your people and to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? Now it pleased the Lord that Solomon had requested this. So God said to him, because you have requested this and did not ask for long life or riches for yourself or the death of your enemies, but you asked for discernment for yourself to administer justice, I will therefore do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has never been anyone like you before and never will be again. In addition, I will give you what you did not ask for, both riches and honor, so that no king will be your equal during your entire life. If you walk in my ways and keep my statutes and commands, just as your father David did, I will give you a long life. Then Solomon woke up, realized it had been a dream. He went to Jerusalem, stood before the ark of the Lord's covenant, and offered burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then he held a feast for all of his servants. So this is what we see in this passage, is that God goes and meets with Solomon so that he can, ask. He's displaying this character of generosity that God is known for, right? This blessedness. He has no reason to just give freely, but he does. He says, Solomon, what do you ask for, right? And so many, Bible studies and kids groups are going to say, hey, the best thing that you could ask for from the Lord is wisdom, because that's what Solomon asked for and he's blessed. There's an argument to be made there, right? And I'll talk about that in a second. But he says, hey, God, you've been so faithful and kind. You've blessed my father David. You've been so generous with him, and you're going to extend this to me. But I'm just a youth. I'm a young king, and I don't know what to do. David was such a dominant king for so long, and he was doing, all these kingly duties. Solomon's brought into this as a relatively young king, and he says, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to judge impartially. I don't know how to be someone who discerns between good and evil. Give me an ability to lead your people well. And God loves this, because ultimately what Solomon is asking for is not just like, hey, make me smarter than any other person. He's saying, hey, give me the ability to know what is good and to act on it, to be able to discern, how do I lead your people? How do I be a better shepherd, right? And God's like, that's what I want for my kings. I want my kings to be good shepherds who are wise, who are kind, who know what to do and do it well. And because you asked for this, I'm going to give you more than what you asked for. I'm going to give you riches and prosperity and long life and all these things. And what we see is kind of an extension of the blessing that God is giving David, right? In the Davidic covenant, where he's saying, hey, you're always going to have a son to sit on the throne so long as they follow me. And, everything is going to go well with you. This is an extension of his blessing to David, because of David's faithfulness, that Solomon gets to reap the benefits. And now Solomon, because he is seeking at first to be a wise king who leads people well, God's going to make his reign prosperous. And throughout this passage, I think one of the things that is going to be stark contrast is the comparison between David's reign and Solomon's reign, because they are quite different. David comes into his kingship through fighting and war, through being on the run, right? Solomon comes in through peace. He's, celebrated, enjoyed, right? David is faithful even before coming king. Solomon is now like reaping the benefits of his father's faithfulness. And now he's going to try to continue. He's starting from a position of, of excellence, and he gets to continue moving forward. And God is going to make his reign look significantly different, as we'll see. The next little passage, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's verses 16 to 28, and it's this story of these two women, these two prostitutes, who are going to Solomon to solve a dispute, because they say, hey, like one of them says, hey, both of them bring this child to Solomon, and they say, that's my son. They both say it. And one says, this is my son, her son died, and the other one says, no, I had the living son. Her son died, and I was, went to sleep, and I woke up, and she had replaced my living son with her dead son. And she's trying to now claim that as my own. And they're like, what do we do? They're trying to resolve this before Solomon. And so Solomon, this is the whole point of this story, is to display that God is actually given him wisdom to solve disputes, to lead his people and shepherd them well. And Solomon's wisdom, he says, bring me a sword. And they're like, what? And I was like, yeah, we'll just cut the baby in half. You get one half of the baby, you get another half of the baby. Now, is Solomon actually intending on cutting this baby in half? We hope not. Probably not, right? He's doing this as a test, because what immediately happens is the woman whose son is actually alive says, no, 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 just let her keep it. I don't let it, because the other one is like, this sounds fair, love it, like, sounds good. And Solomon's like, okay, well, it's clearly the one who wants the baby alive. That's his actual mother. Give her the son completely, right? And it's at like verse 28, like says, all Israel heard about the judgment the king had given, and they stood in awe at the king because they saw that God's wisdom was in him to carry justice. And it's this really kind of weird story, but in essence, the whole point of it is to show that God is giving Solomon wisdom. This is the proof of God's blessing. In the following verses that we're going to read in chapter 4 and in chapter 10, verses 20 and 21, 24 and 25, 29 through 34, and then 1 Kings 10, 23 and 25, or through 25, these display as well, again, how God is blessing Solomon. We're going to talk about these blessings in a second. But it says in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 20 and 21, Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea. They were eating and drinking and rejoicing. Solomon ruled all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines, and as far as the border of Egypt. They offered tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. Verses 24 and 25 said, for he had dominion over everything west of the Euphrates, from Tifshah to Gaza, and over all the kings west of the Euphrates. He had peace on all of his surrounding borders. Throughout Solomon's reign, Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan to Beersheba. And if you're a fan of Hamilton, you get to enjoy this line. Each person under his own vine and his own fig tree. This is a Jewish idiom, basically meaning in peace and in independence. Then they're in control of what's going on. Verses 29 to 34, it says, God gave Solomon wisdom, very great insight and understanding, and as vast as the sand of the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman, Calcol, and Darda, sons of Mahol. You know all of them, I'm sure. His reputation extended to all the surrounding nations. Solomon spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. Make sure you remember those extra 5. He spoke about trees, from the cedar in Lebanon to the hyssop growing out of the wall. He also spoke about animals, birds, reptiles, and fish. Emissaries of all people sent by every king on earth who had heard of his wisdom came to listen to Solomon's wisdom. And in 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 23 to 25, it says, King Solomon surpassed all the kings of the world in riches and in wisdom. The whole world wanted an audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom that God had put in his heart. Every man would bring his annual tribute, items of silver and gold, clothing, weapons, spices, horses, and mules, right? What we see in these passages is God's immense generosity with blessings. He is saying, I'm going to give what you asked for and so much more. He's giving, and a lot of this is not just things for Solomon. This is a continuation of God's covenant faithfulness, the things that he spoke to Abraham, the things that he spoke to David, the things that he spoke to all of these Jewish, forefathers. He's saying, fruitful population, that Judah and Israel are now, numerous as the sand in the sea, right? Like that they are extended borders, that they are now like a complete nation. They're not fighting to gain territory anymore. There's peace and dominion. David was a king of war, constantly fighting the Philistines and all these people who would seek to attack him. Solomon's reign is known for its peace. He's able to build, he's able to create. Your population grows in times of peace because there's no one being sent to war to die, right? Your borders are extended because they already got fought for, right? There's peace and dominion. People can live under their own vine and fig tree because there's independence, right? That they are fine. They don't lack for anything. They're able to sustain themselves. And Solomon has this incredible wisdom that the whole world has heard. There's this interesting story in chapter 10 of the Queen of Sheba, right, coming to Solomon. And that's a whole other kind of tangent where it's like she may or may not have been one of his wives or concubines or someone that he was intimate with, but that's a whole other thing, right? But it's people from all over the world seeking Solomon's wisdom that they want to hear because it's famous that God is with Solomon and moving in power. And then it shows his immense wealth, right? Again, Solomon's reign is known for prosperity in land, prosperity in people, prosperity in material goods, lots of money, lots of gold. He is enriching the land. It goes into detail about the amount of like people that are on his staff, right? His officials, his court, who are leading and governing the different areas of Israel. He is creating a well-functioning system, but because of that, he also needs more money and tribute to actually function, to do these things well. And so you see God pouring out this immense blessing on Solomon, treating him with such incredible kindness and goodness, that he is giving him all of these things that Solomon at this point, he's followed God for sure, but like, it's not like this is a thing that he earned for himself. God is doing this because he said, hey, I will be generous and bless you if you just follow me, right? And so there's a few things that I think I want us to address in this passage. First is this idea of God's generosity, that do we actually lean on this as followers of Christ? Matthew 7 is going to say, ask and you shall receive, knock and the door will be opened to you, seek and you will find, right? Throughout scripture, we're given these passages where we're saying, hey, like, approach the Lord and he's going to give faithfully. Ephesians 3:20 says he does far more than what we can expect or imagine. But I don't pray that way. And I would imagine that few people do. We don't pray in a way to say, like, give me the abundance of your riches and your mercies and the things that you would provide. I pray small things. I pray for, things that I think are reasonable. But God says, no, be bold, ask for more. And God will graciously give more than you could. Like, you're never going to out ask the Lord. You're never going to, give, like, make a request and be like, ugh, that's outside of my power, right? Now, there are certain things that are outside of his will. There's things that are outside of his, like, what is good. But if it is a good request inside of his will, God is capable, right? And he is beyond generous. He is a blessing God, right? Jesus dying on the cross is an act of generosity, giving life that we didn't deserve in an immense way. He didn't just make us, negative to neutral. He made us negative to positive, to inheritors of the kingdom of Christ, right? We were dead and then he brought us life, right? There's generosity, incredible generosity in the blessings and the prosperity that the Lord gives us. And so I think one of the things that we can encourage our students with, and if it's one of the things that like kind of sticks with y'all, is like, what do we ask for the Lord? How do we approach God? What do we request of him? And do we request enough? Do we boldly go to him and say, Lord, give, not because, we just want him to be a genie, but because we trust him to be a good father who gives good gifts. We trust him to be a father who is generous, who loves us and wants good for us, right? This isn't prosperity gospel stuff where it's just like, hey, God wants you to be wealthy. He may not. Blessings and prosperity may look different than wealth and numerous populations, right? Prosperity and blessedness may mean just being consumed by the joy of God, that he is giving abundantly of himself, right? I talked about earlier again about, like, is wisdom the best thing we can ask for? I think wisdom is a great thing to ask for, but I think the best thing that we could ask for is more of God, is more of his presence, is an abundance of who he is, because we will never be able to have enough God, right? Like, he will never, he's never going to give us all of himself, right? He can abundantly give more and more. So I think that's a beautiful thing to ask for, is just more of God, more of his blessings upon us, right? Second thing, it's this idea of the relationship between blessings and obedience, because again, this is a blessing because of David's faithfulness. And he continues, he says, I will, if you walk in my ways and keep my statutes and commands just as your father did, I will give you a long life. And if you know Solomon's history, if we're looking ahead, right? Again, as we mentioned at the top of this study, Solomon is unfortunately going to start really well. He has all this wisdom and prosperity, but he is going to stop using it. Just because he has wisdom doesn't mean he's living in it. Just because he was walking with God doesn't mean he continues to do so. And he is going to lead himself and all of Israel astray into a season of incredible spiritual decay and detriment, right? And we see all these blessings coming from his obedience, but we're going to see the opposite come through with all of those blessings taken away from Israel because of their disobedience. And again, this isn't a prosperity gospel where, like, why do we obey the Lord? So that we are, receiving wealth and goodness and all these things. That's not why you obey. You obey because who God is better than anything else, than any other alternative. And being with the Lord, walking in his statutes and commands, leads to a life that is blessed and prosperous, even if it doesn't look that way financially or materialistically. Like, just being with God, there is prosperity. Now, some of those things may be a result of our obedience. I think there's wise practices, things like that, but material goods and things like that, that's not what the aim for in blessing. It's the Lord. It's being with God and prospering with him. So there's ultimately this great connection between obedience and having the blessings of God. And that's what we see lived out in Jesus. Again, our true King, who is the source of all wisdom, who is wise in and of himself, who gives generously of himself and everything he has. He is the source of wealth. He is wealth, right? Like, he is everything. He is power and prosperity and influence and anything good. And he generously gives of those things, but also in his life, that he is perfectly obedient and has perfect relationship with the Lord, that no one is more blessed than Jesus. No one is more favored and highly regarded than our Lord, than our true King. And that's the example that we have to live for, right? That we worship him. We also want to seek to live like him. We want to be obedient like Christ was, so that we can have perfect relationship with God like Jesus did. As you go through this study, I'd encourage you to walk through this, because again, there's a lot of practical things, but again, as all of this, there's so much beauty to dive into. So hope y'all enjoy this. Enjoy your studies. Have a great time. We'll see you on Wednesday.